Hello and welcome to TagoIO. In this video, we're going to go over how to publish a connector by using the Open Connector Github repository. First, let's recap how data arrives at TagoIO. The data first needs to be sent from an IoT device. This can be done via MQTT, LoRaWAN, or just a simple HTTPS post request. After having done that, the data then arrives at TagoIO. The first payload parser layer is the network. This layer is usually in charge of parsing the usual network data, like RSSI and gateway names. Once the data has passed through the network parser, it will then be welcomed to the connector payload parser. This payload parser is focused on parsing specific device data. This will bring out device data like temperature, pressure, and more, depending on the device. After that layer, we then have the optional layer known as device payload parser. This is an optional layer that has the objective of allowing users to tweak their data before it is stored in the device's bucket. Lastly, we have the data being stored in the device's bucket, meaning that the data is now safe at TagoIO and can be edited if your device is a mutable device. So what is the Open Connector repository? It's an open source repository that contains all the necessary tools and guidelines for publishing new and existing connectors in the TagoIO platform. After publishing a connector, any TagoIO user will be able to pick that connector when creating a device. The user will be able to view the device's image and general information. Here are some of the advantages of using the repository. Publishing a device adds it to a global marketplace of devices, helping other users to get to know your device and its benefits. You'll be able to add keywords that will help users find your device in the TagoIO admin and also the TagoIO website. Uniform and strict payload parser codes following guidelines in place such as linter and unit test verifications. All connectors are manually reviewed by a TagoIO developer before being deployed. Also, in case you don't want to publish a connector, you can still manually share the private connector to any user through the share feature. So now let's start our tutorial. First thing we have to do is head over to the GitHub repository. You can do that by finding it in the TagoIO GitHub profile, and then going to the decoders repository. Now we need to download the repository. We can do that by cloning the repository through the git command on our terminal. To do that, let's copy this. And now let's open our terminal. Let's go to where I want to store the project file. So that would be desktop connector. Now let's write git clone and the link. So now we're cloning the repository to our local machine. Now let's enter that project. And I'm going to open it in Visual Studio Code. So now let's install the dependencies using npm. But first, make sure that npm installed. To do that, write npm in your terminal. npm. Now the next thing to do is npm install. So now we have all the dependencies necessary in order to start working on our connector. So let's go over to decoders, connector. Let's open the Dragino one, for example. Here we have all the Dragino devices that have a connector. So let's create a fictitious brand and connector. I'm going to name mine TagoIO brand, and inside a device called TagoIO device. Now we can create our device's connector files, starting with the connector.jsonc. It will contain information regarding where the connector's image, decoder, and description is. The JSONC will basically explain where the deploying code will be able to get the connector's file paths so that it can process and publish the connector correctly on TagoIO. That's why you use the schema, which makes sure connector.jsonc is correctly configured. So now let's add our connector's decoder, unit test, and image file. This will be version 1, so let's create a folder named v1.0.0 and add the decoder along its payload config manifest and tests. The payload config file is in charge of keeping all the information regarding this version of the payload parser. In this case, that's information like the markdown description file path, the installation text, the device configuration parameters, and most importantly, the networks you can use this connector in conjunction with. For example, my TagoIO device connector can be used with the Evernet, City Connect, and Curlink networks, along with this entire list. We also have the example decoder and test file here. Don't forget, all the connectors must be in TypeScript and need to include unit tests. Zooming out of the version 1.0.0 folder, we also need to add the device's image. Make sure to follow the path that you've added in the logo. And we also need to add the device's description using our description markdown file. So let's add it here. Make sure that it is in the correct path. So check that in your payload config.json. So mine is correct here. Now we can check if everything's correct. To do so, let's run our tests, linter, and validator to check if our files are correctly configured. So to do that, let's go to the terminal and run npm test. Same for our linter. And also the validator file. Now that we've added and verified all the files necessary, we can create a pull request. But in order to do that, first we need to publish our branch. Let's follow the branch naming convention, which is feet followed by connector or network, and the brand name. So in my case, there, I've created my branch. Now let's add a commit message. I'm going to add mine here and add all the changes. Now let's commit and now publish the branch. With our branch now published, we can open a pull request. Let's go over to the repository to do so. Here we have a template of the pull request. The first section is simply a description of what we are adding to the repository. In the second section, you'll select what type of change you're committing. After that, you must add what type of verification document you use to produce the decoder so that the TagoIO team can verify your code. And lastly, a checklist to make sure you've correctly done all the steps needed for a successful PR. All that's left to do now is wait for your PR to be approved. If additional modifications are needed, you will receive a notification in your email. And for more information, visit tago.io.